Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing the Spellbinders August 2025 clubs. So this one has some great ocean-inspired pieces in it. First off, we have the wax seal of the month, which is called Mermaid Tails. And instead of wax pieces, we have some wax seal stickers. Then we have the 3D embossing folder of the month called Underwater Waltz, as well as the embossing folder of the month called Coral Impression. The stencil of the month is called Underwater Bloom, and it creates a underwater look. So we have, some seaweed, a little bit of coral, as well as some bubbles there. So it's going to be fun for a stenciled background. The clear stamp of the month, and I also have the dies that go with it, are called Paper Splash. And we have two different images there, as well as several sentiments that go with it. The BetterPress of the month is called Fish Parade, and there is a registration template with it in order to line up the sentiment to go with it, and there's 3 different sentiments to choose from, as well as coordinating dies. The Glimmer of the month is called Beneath the Bubbles, and for the Glimmer foil, we have some prism speckle foil, or speckled prism foil for that, which is perfect for those fish, as well as the bubbles. The stitching die of the month is called Hand Folded Stitch, and it is an origami boat, which is absolutely adorable. The die of the month is called the Deep Blue 2, and we have some scuba divers as well as some different accents to use with them. And then the large die of the month is called Splash Tail. So there's some seaweed in there, there's a little sand castle, as well as a mermaid and like a goldfish. This here is the caboodle of this month, and it's called Fish Friends. For my color palette inspiration, I'm using one of the cards from the DIY color deck, and it's perfect for these underwater cards. So I'm going to start off by doing my hot foiling. So I have a piece of the speckled prism glimmer foil cut a little bit larger than my hammer mill cardstock. I heated up my glimmer system and then put my plate on there, put the pretty side of that foil towards the plate, and then my hammer mill cardstock on top, as well as the plates. Press the timer button, and once that was done, I put it through the Platinum 6 machine, and we have this adorable, beautiful bubble background here. So I also thought this would look fantastic in opal foil. So I have some opal glimmer foil here. Again, perfect for those bubbles. The only thing with that opal foil is, as you can see when I took it off the roll, it's transparent. So if you cut it off ahead of time, it's really hard to see which is the side that goes against the plate and which is the side that goes against the hammer or the cardstock. So I will regularly cut that as I'm about to use it so that I don't lose track of which side is which. The outside of the roll is the side that goes against the plate, just to make it a little bit easier to remember. So it's a little bit harder to see those bubbles on that white cardstock, but you can see the shimmer that it creates. I'm going to ink blend those backgrounds, so it's going to make those bubbles really, really pop, and I just love the little opal shine that they have. I have the sentiments from that hot foil of the month that I'm doing, glimmer of the month that I'm doing with that speckled prism foil. I just have a little piece of hammer mill cardstock for that. So I am going to do the solid hot foiling for these sentiments as well. However, I don't use them in any cards because that speckled prism foil is just so over the top. It makes it really hard to read those sentiments on or with the solid hot foil. So I actually don't use them, but the rest of the pieces, or the solid hot foiled piece around it, I will use those for doing some die cutting. So you'll see that in this video. After I'm done using that bubbles plate, I'm taking the BetterPress of the month, the Fish Parade, and I am using that speckled prism foil for that fish, and I think it just works perfectly for those. That speckled part of the prism foil almost makes it look like fish scales. Then I take the sentiments from that set, and I'm foiling those with that speckled prism foil as well. I could have done these sentiments with the opal cardstock and then use some distress ink in order to bring that sentiment out, but I opted to only do the opal foil with those bubbles. So here is those sentiments, and all of these extra negative foil pieces I'm going to take and I'm going to negative hot foil them using a solid hot foil plate. I do this pretty much every single time I do hot foiling. First of all, if I'm not going to use it, it's much easier to store the foiled cardstock than those flimsy pieces of foil. But secondly, even if it's a piece that I'm not going to use, I will regularly use the outside pieces for doing die cutting. So I'll use them as specialty cardstocks, and they make some really unique accents. Some of the solid hot foiled prism foil I will also use as a mat behind my image pieces. So for my opal foil here. Once you've done that first foiling, it's a little bit easier to see the different sides. So I didn't have to worry too much about not being able to tell which side was which when it came to the solid hot foiling. When you do that first foiling, it takes some of that foil off, obviously, when you're doing that first foiling. So it's a lot easier to see which is the side that goes against the plate and which is the side that goes against the cardstock. Then I'm going to solid hot foil my bubbles. And again, this bubbles here, it's a little bit over the top, so I would never use this as a card background, but it works perfectly for using as a mat around my bubble background. It just kind of frames it all. It has those bubbles in there. Again, they're opposite of the first embossing, but they're a great way to frame that so it doesn't go to waste. So it's really hard to actually see it in the video, but I have this thin line towards the top right side of that solid hot foil piece. That's because there was a hair between the foil and my cardstock. So keep in mind that if that happens, you're going to get an impression or a mark in there. It's not going to foil in those areas. I didn't actually notice it, obviously, because it was just a thin little piece there, but you definitely want to, if you see those types of things, you want to take them out ahead of time because it's going to affect your foiling. So here is the solid hot foiled sentiments, and you can see how over the top they are. Sometimes, depending on the foil, sometimes like just regular prism foil, I will use that solid hot foil, but it's the speckled one that just goes over the top. So after foiling there, I'm using my wax starter kit to use the wax seal of the month to create a couple of wax seals. I always love to do these two things, the foiling as well as the wax seals ahead of time. And I like to do more than I think I'm going to use in my cards. I always love to have a lot of choice when I'm creating. So because the wax seals or the wax seal of the month came with the wax seal stickers, I'm using some teal mix wax seals or wax in order to create the seals for this video. It's going to go well with the colors that I'm using for my cards. So I started off with 4 of the darker color wax beads, melted them and put that seal in there. Now, because this seal is such a unique shape, it's kind of got an art shape to it. I don't really like the bubbled part around the outside. I just don't really like the look of that. So I'm going to use my detail scissors. I'm going to trim that off, and all of that excess wax can be remelted. So there's very little waste when it comes to this. If you create a seal that you don't like, you can just remelt it. So you're not wasting anything by just playing around. Now, after cutting it, I could leave that seal as is, and it's still really, really pretty, but I really want to bring out the picture or the image of that mermaid tail. So I'm using a silver Posca pen, and I'm just coloring the raised surface. It just brings out the detail of it. You can see it so much better with that coloring on top of there. So I set that aside to dry, and now I'm ready to pour my next seal. So because of the shape of this, I do kind of pour it in kind of like an oval shape before pressing that seal into there. And just like that first one, I'm going to use my detailed scissors and trim out the next one here as well. I take the pieces that I cut off, put them right into the little spoon or little scoop for melting. That way I can just reuse it right away. I do create a third one, but I don't use it at all. And I actually touch it a little bit too soon. My wax hasn't completely sealed, but I also knew that I wasn't actually going to be using a third one. So I just put that into my container with the rest of my wax seals. Now, in order to clean off the scoop as well as the tools, while everything is still hot, I use a clean piece of paper towel. It cleans that whole scoop out. Now, last time I used my wax seal, I got some wax, or my scoop, I got some wax on the bottom. So that black mark on my silicone mat there was some soot from burning that wax on the bottom of my scoop. The candle had run out of wax, so it was really not very hot, so I couldn't melt or clean all of that stuff off. So it's a really good idea every single time you use your wax starter kit or whatever to clean everything off so you can prevent that basically. So with my seals done as well as my foiling done, I'm ready to die cut those foil sentiments out. I use the Best Ever craft tape in order to tape those dies in place. I always like making sure that my dies aren't going to move, especially if I'm matching them to either a sentiment or an image. I want to make sure that I have everything lined up as best as possible. And by taping that in place, I know that my dies aren't going to move on me. So with all of those sentiments done and ready to go, I am ready to start making my cards. I also die cut the solid hot foiled sentiments, but like I said, I end up not using them because they're just too much and it was really hard to read those sentiments. There's a tiny little bit of overfoiling for some of those sentiments. So I just take a thicker or a wider piece of Best Ever Craft tape. I do put it on my shirt a couple times first to take just an edge off that tackiness. And then I put it over top of my sentiment and it'll take off some of that overfoiling. If there's a piece that tape doesn't take off, you can use a sand eraser. This one's from Tombow, and that will help remove any excess foil as well. The one thing to keep in mind though is if you sand right over top of your foiling, it's going to affect that foiling. So when I'm using that eraser, I'm really careful of where I'm actually using that sand eraser on, because I don't want to affect the finish of my foiling. So this is where I was talking about even the negative foiled sentiments there's some larger areas around the outside of it. That's the part that I use for die cutting. So I have the Caboodle die set here, the Fish Friends, and I'm using a couple of those dies for a little bit of the accent pieces for those die cuts. It's going to tie in those die cuts with my bubbles background, and it's just a great way to use up that cardstock. I know you can buy prism holographic foil like this. It's not always easy to find, and if you have some here that's solid hot foiled from doing your hot foiling, why not use it up, and why not create some unique pieces with that. For the rest of my fish here, I have them die cut out of white cardstock, and I'm going to create a little bit of ink blending with some color shift ink pads. These are from Lisa Horton Crafts, and these are like the interference pads that I love so much, but these ones are better for blending two colors together. So I have my sticky mat out, I have my die cuts on them. It's going to hold them nice and secure. For that first one there, the two colors I used was Peanut Glow, which is kind of that browny butterscotch color there, and then I used Fruit Punch. For the second one here, I'm using Coral Waters and Watermelon Spritz. They're fairly similar in tone, but the watermelon is a little bit darker and a little bit more of a red tone, and then the coral is a little bit more of a peachy tone. So I blended those two colors together on the die cuts, set those aside. I always clean off my mat between using them for ink blending so that when I go to use it again, I know that it's nice and clean, and I will be using it often in this video for doing my ink blended backgrounds. So with that ink blending done, I'm ready to assemble those fish. So one of them only has 2 layers, so I have that ink blended piece over top of the die cut prism or speckled prism foiled piece. And then the clownfish here, I have the other accents done with Raven cardstock. So I glue those pieces on first. There's a little die cut that goes behind the opening of the eye. And then there's those accent pieces that I die cut from the speckled prism foil, and they just kind of bring that fish to life. And once I add it to the background with the bubbles, it really coordinates well together. So this solid hot foiled piece, I am just trimming down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and I will do it around all 4 edges. Sometimes when I solid hot foil, there's an edge that gets missed, so I just kind of judge my trimming based on that. And then my regular foil piece, I have that trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So for my backgrounds, and for all of my backgrounds that I remember, I have 3 different distress colors that I'm using. So the lightest color here is Salvage Patina. The next color for the center part is Evergreen Bow. And then for the bottom part of this background, I'm doing Uncharted Waters. So I typically will use Uncharted Waters with more blue tones because of the color card that I chose, and I chose to do more kind of aqua colors with that kind of tealy dark color. I chose to use these ones, and I really love the final look of it. So this is the background, or the way that I'm ink blending all of the backgrounds. There's a couple that I add a little bit of vintage photo to the bottom because I want it to have more of a sandy bottom, and you'll see obviously those ones when I get to them. But if I don't need it to have a sandy bottom, I'm just using these 3 colors, and I really love how they blend together well. I use large Spellbinders ink blending brushes for those backgrounds. It covers a lot of area in a little time, and you can get really light ink blending or heavy ink blending depending on your pressure and how much ink you use. So I glued those pieces onto my card base and then chose a sentiment, glued that to the bottom, and then I'm choosing 2 of those fish from that Caboodle set. So for this particular one, I have them at different levels. I'm going to do this very similar card to this with my opal foiled background, just so you can see the difference between them. And then I'm going to just position the fish for that one, just a tiny little bit different. So for this one, I'm ink blending both the foiled as well as the negative foiled background. I'm using the same blending brush for both the Salvage Patina and the Evergreen Bow. So you'll see me when I go for that first card, I used the Salvage Patina first, but for the rest of the backgrounds, I start with the centerpiece because the last color I used was that Evergreen Bow, and I want to make sure that the color isn't really dark still on my ink blending brush. So to err on the side of caution, I just go and do that centerpiece first to remove any ink from my brush. Then I go back into the Salvage Patina so that I don't have a dark area at the top of my ink blended background here. So you can see how differently the backgrounds look between the regular foiled and the solid hot foiled. Sometimes you might want the solid hot foiled for whatever look you're going for. For this, I'm only using that solid hot foiled for the matte around it, but I wanted the bubbles to show up and just pop a little bit more, so I did that ink blending. I also used a clean microfiber cloth once I was done to remove any ink that might be on that foiled surface. Even though that foiled resists the ink, there's a lot of ink on your brushes and they might just still be on there. And for me, there's a very good chance I would touch it with my fingers and then touch something that I didn't want to have ink all over it and get a fingerprint on it. So always a good habit to use either clean paper towel or just a clean cloth just to wipe any of that ink off and clean up that ink blending. Once I have that matte on there, I can glue down my ink blended background here with the foiled bubbles. Now, here's where I'm just going to change up the layout just a tiny little bit. Another thing here is you could easily do a horizontal card with these too. It would not necessarily work with these bubbles because the bubble plate is a vertical plate. Unless you were doing a smaller background with it, then you could create a more horizontal card, just depending on the look that you're going for. So once I'm done with this, one of the things I love to do is add a little bit of extra texture to my cards, and I will often do that with either stickles or glossy accents. When it comes to underwater fish cards, I often like to use glossy accents to add little bubbles. Now, even though this background already has bubbles to it, I wanted to add just a little bit of texture, and you can see that by putting that glossy accents on there, it doesn't add any color. Glossy accents is totally clear, but it just adds some glossy bubbles that kind of catch the light when you tilt it into the light. For my next card, I'm using the foiled BetterPress of the month, the fish there. I'm using the same colors for my ink blended background. I'm trying to make the colors fairly dark for this because it's just going to show off that foil a little bit better. I find, especially with really bold foil like this, that the darker colors, in my opinion, just seem to show that off a little better. It just highlights it a little bit better. So I do end up going a little bit darker on this background than the rest of them, mainly for that reason. I really want to show off those fish. So I'm going to use the solid piece for the matte on here. That is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. The foiled piece, the ink blended piece here, is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And then all I need to do is add one of those die cut sentiments. Off screen, I did die cut some extra white cardstock, and I added that behind my sentiments so that they would have just a little bit of dimension to them. It's not a step that's necessary, and I don't do it all the time. It just depends on the look that I'm going for. Just like those first 2 cards, I add little bubbles to this one with the glossy accents because there's a large cluster of fish here. Typically when I do that, there's not this many fish, and I'll do kind of a trail of bubbles going up, and usually it ends up being 3, 4, 5 bubbles. Because this is more of a cluster of fish, most of them will have 1, maybe 2 bubbles, depending on how much space there is. But it's something that doesn't add color. Again, it just adds a little bit of extra texture, and once that's dry and you tilt it into the light, you just kind of, those bubbles kind of catch that light. For my next card here, I'm once again going to use that BetterPress of the month, but I'm going to do a little bit of an Emboss resist with it. I'm using those same color shift pads that I used for the fish at the from the Caboodle set to do that ink blending. I have a piece of Hammermill cardstock here. I'm also adding 2 other of the color shift pads. I'm using Lilac Meadow as well as Golden Heather just to add a little bit of purple to this background. You can see that I'm just kind of creating blobs on my background and it kind of looks like a hot mess. I'm just trying to get a bunch of colors here. Once I'm done this, I'm going to heat emboss those fish or the fish bubbles in clear embossing powder. So we're going to see the colors of this ink through that embossing. I was hoping we would see a little bit more of the shimmer, but you really don't see the shimmer. So this technique would also work with other pads as well. I'm using these because I use them already, and I was hoping, like I said, to be able to see the shimmer with that embossing. But just know that you really don't see it. You see the color, you don't see the shimmer to it. Now, because this has some shimmer to it, when I do the inking over top of my embossing, some of that shimmer will show through that background. I knew that was going to happen, and I was counting on that look to it. If you don't want that to show up, this is a step that you should just use with, say, regular distress pads or just regular dye-based pads. It doesn't need to be pretty ink blending. It's just a bunch of colors to show up through that clear embossing. But I do want it over that whole background, mainly because the color that I'm doing my inking with after I do the embossing is Uncharted Mariner, and it's not completely black, so it's not going to cover the color that's on my background here. It's only going to kind of mute it a little bit. So after doing that ink blending, I'm using my embossing powder tool over that whole background. When it comes to my embossing, I want to make sure that embossing powder only sticks to my Versamark ink and it doesn't stick to anywhere on this background. So by using that embossing tool, that helps me to absorb any moisture that is in this ink. To test my background to make sure there's no moist spots or spots that embossing powder is going to stick to, I just pour some of that embossing powder on the background. If it sticks anywhere, I know I need to use a little bit more embossing powder tool, and that's what I end up doing here. And then I go and grab my container again and I test it once again. I want to make sure again that that embossing powder is only going to stick where I want it to stick. So by testing it here, I know that I don't have any sticky areas and I'm going to get a nice clear image. So I'm going to use this plate with my BetterPress system. I'm going to use the template to put the sentiment on the bottom there. Now, this sentiment here, or the template there, you could even just place your sentiment wherever you want it to go. It is nice to know that there is a template to make sure that it's centered in the bottom, but it's not, in my opinion, absolutely necessary for this particular plate. Once I have that in place, and I do tape my template to the bottom, I want to make sure that it doesn't move on me because it takes a little bit of the strength of the magnet from the base of the BetterPress. I do find that the plates move a little bit more on here. So by taping that template in place, I know that I can push my press plates right back where they're supposed to go. So I ink that plate with Versamark ink, put the clear plate onto the base, and then run it through my Platinum 6 machine to press that image into that cardstock. Then I can pour my clear embossing powder over that Versamark ink. It's a little bit harder to see the image on this background here because all of that ink blending kind of makes it a little bit colorful, a little bit harder to see that embossing powder, but it is on there. Then I use my embossing tool in order to melt that powder on the background. Obviously, because we're using clear powder, it is a little bit invisible, but we're going to be using some ink over top of it to make it show up, to make these fish show up. I do tilt my piece into the light to make sure that everything is melted properly before I do my ink blending over top of there. So I start by doing my background with my ink blending brush, and then I want my ink to be a little bit heavier. I want those fish to show up just a little bit more. So I end up going direct to paper with my ink pad just to get a heavier amount of ink on there. You also will need a clean piece of paper towel or a clean dry cloth in order to remove any of that ink that is on top of that embossing. As you're looking at it now, those fish don't show up really, really well, but once you clean off that ink, it shows up a little bit better. And it actually shows up a little bit better in real life or in person than it does on video. But you can see the colors underneath that ink there. Now, if I wanted the colors to be just a little bit brighter, using black on that background would make those fish just a tiny little bit brighter. However, because these are underwater images, I wanted it to be more of ocean or watercolor. For my mat for this card, I have a piece of Hammermill cardstock trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. And I'm using the Fruit Punch Color Shift pad to color in the outsides of that. It's just going to tie in one of the colors that is in the fish with the mat around the card. For the fish image itself, I have that trimmed, or I trimmed that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So for assembling all of my cards as well as my die cuts, I'm using Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. This works perfectly for larger pieces like the layers on cards, but it also works really well for gluing different like tiny die cuts together. So you can use as much or as little glue. And I like the liquid glue because it gives you some wiggle room in order to move and shimmy things in place. So again, a very, very simple card, but it has some fun texture to it because of that embossing as well as the color underneath the embossing. For my next card, I'm using the Splash Tails Large Die of the Month, and I'm going to create a bit of a shaker card. It's not going to have shaker bits in it that move around, but I wanted to make sure, I wanted to create a card where that goldfish had a little bit of wiggle room to it. So I have the pieces for the little bag for the fish. The background is done with fog cardstock as well as some anchor cardstock for where the top of the water would be as well as the bottom of the bag. This particular die set has an inner piece, and I used that to create a frame for the bag to create different layers for the shaker card or the shaker mechanism. I have the pieces of the goldfish die cut out of coral cardstock as well as carrot cardstock. Again, the pieces are really easy to layer together when you're using layering dies because when you do the die cutting process, it puts an indent and shows you exactly where the upper pieces are intended to go. So there's very little guesswork to it. Using liquid glue also helps to move those places or pieces in place to make sure that you get perfect placement. I did a little bit of light ink blending at the bottom of the bag just to give it the look of water. I just used whatever ink was left on my brush that I was using for the Uncharted Mariner. So it's not really dark ink blending. You still see that fog cardstock underneath there, but it just adds a little bit of that tealy tone to it. For my goldfish, I'm just using some Coral Waters the Color Shift ink just to do a little bit of ink blending to add a little bit of visual dimension. It's also going to add just a touch of shimmer to it. For the mechanism for my shaker card, I want my goldfish to kind of be in a certain area, but I want it to have a little bit of movement. So I have some nylon thread here from my craft room. I'm just cutting a length of it, taping the back of it in place behind my die cut there with some Best Ever craft tape. Off screen, I die cut another of the gold shift or goldfish bases to glue on the back. That way I can ensure that that piece or that tape isn't going to ever give up on me. I know it's going to be, that thread is going to be secure on that die cut. So I have 4 pieces of this bag outline die cut. Now, if you want your fish to have more movement than mine does, you'll want to cut a couple more pieces. Because that goldfish has 3 layers of cardstock, 2 of the base as well as 1 layer of the, or 1 piece of the upper layers, there's not going to be a ton of movement in this particular card. I did that on purpose because for myself, I wanted that goldfish to wiggle a little bit. I didn't want it to have a lot of movement to it. But if you're wanting to create a mechanism that has more movement than mine does, then add an extra layer or 2 of cardstock for your shaker pieces. So I cut 2 pieces down, or glued 2 pieces down, and then glued my goldfish in place, making sure there's glue at the top of the thread as well as the bottom, but also making sure there's just a little bit of slack in that thread. If that thread's too tight, your goldfish isn't going to move. So I made sure that there was just a little bit of room for it to move back and forth. And depending on how much slack you have in your thread, that's how much movement your fish is going to have. Then I'm going to glue the upper 2 layers of those frames on there. And then I have a piece of Duralar that was die cut with the outer edge of the gold or the bag. And that is going to give me the clear top to my shaker piece here. Now, when I'm creating shaker cards that are rectangle or square, I'll just use my trimmer and trim that piece down, and I'll just use other acetate. It doesn't matter what kind it is. It doesn't need to be special. When I'm die cutting pieces, I like to use Duralar. It die cuts really nicely and it has a nice clear finish to it. So I put my glue on all the way around the outer edge as well as on the upper part of the bag. I made sure to only put the glue on the upper part of the bag where these die cuts here were going to cover it. Because that Duralar is clear, you're going to see where that glue is. Around the outside of the bag, I have the glue covering the whole thing, so you're not going to really get glue marks on there. If the whatever glue you have on there bothers you being able to see it, you can also die cut an extra outside frame of the bag, just like the pieces that we used for the layers building it up, and glue that on top, and that would cover any glue that you have there. I wanted to use one of my wax seals and make it look like it was a tag on the top of this bag here. So I used the wax seal sticker in order to glue that in place. The wax seal sticker is just a little bit bigger than the seal, so I just used my detail scissors in order to trim that down so that it was the right size for that seal and it held it together nice and securely. And then I glued the little floss piece that I had die cut out of Oceanside cardstock for the string on the top of my piece there. The background on my card, I looked at it with my fish bag here and it just looked a little bit plain. So I used the embossing folder of the month just to create some texture in that background. I layered them together with it being just white like this. And while it looked totally fine, I wanted to tie in the colors of that goldfish just a little bit more. So I pulled out my color shift pads in Coral Waters and Watermelon Spritz, and I'm first starting with that Coral Waters, and I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending around the edge. I didn't feel like I needed this all over that background, but I just wanted to frame the edge and, like I said, tie in the colors of that goldfish and just kind of pull everything together. So the nice thing with the color shift pads is they're a creamy ink, but they do have a little bit of a shimmer to them, just like the interference pads. These are better for blending a couple colors in to each other simply because the ink stays wet for a little bit longer. And like I said, it's a creamier ink, so it's just a little bit more blending friendly. When you're using the interference inks, I don't often use it to blend out to nothing like this because it dries really, really quickly and often leaves harsher edges. This ink is the perfect solution for that. So it just depends on the type of creating you like to do and the type of look you like to come out with as to whether the color shift inks would be a better choice for you or the interference inks. There's a lot more color choices in interference inks. At this point, there's only 12 colors in the color shift inks. I don't know if there's going to be more. I certainly hope there will be. But there are two different formulas. I've used both inks I've used the interference inks in many videos simply because they've been around a lot longer. But I did do a few with the color shift inks. Both of them have playlists, so if you'd like to see those inks used a little bit more, you'll find videos in those playlists using them and sharing some of the ways that I love to use those inks. So with my outer edges of that embossed piece ink blended, and I did that Coral Waters first and then the Watermelon Spritz just to kind of frame it a little bit darker. I can glue that to the matte on my card, and that was done with the Oceanside cardstock. And then I can glue my little shaker element on there as well as my sentiment and let those dry for a few minutes. You want to be liberal with the glue when you're die cutting on top, or not die cutting, when you're gluing on top of an embossed background because you have a little bit less surface for that to stick to. So you want to make sure that you have a good amount of glue to stick to that. So there's the finished shaker card, and you can see that my fish there, it has room to move, but it doesn't move a lot, and that's by design. I wanted it to kind of just wiggle and just have a little bit of movement to it. I'm going to also use the large die of the month for my next card, but I'm pairing it with a previous club die set. So this is the whale in the bottle die set. I'm going to use this for the card background as well as the little cork stop to it. It pairs perfectly with the whale in the bottle, and you can pair it even more with some of the other dies in that set. I'm only using the bottle outline as well as the cork for this one. So this is one of the ones that I'm doing the background with adding a little bit of vintage photo. I wanted to have a little bit of sand to the bottom. I used the vintage photo on the cork piece, the upper layer of the cork piece as well, just to give that a little bit of dimension to it. Now this bottle piece is die cut out of a piece of cardstock that is 4¼ by 5½ inches. And you may notice that the top of the bottle is a little bit flat. That's because it is just a little bit too tall for a piece of cardstock that's 4¼ by 5½ inches. My cork die cut is going to cover that piece, but just note that this card will need to be put in like a 5x7 envelope. It won't fit in an envelope for a 4¼ by 5½ inch card. It's just a little bit too tall. For the card base, I have a second piece of that bottle die cut, and I scored it at 4½ inches. That top scored piece will glue to the back of my ink blended background piece there, and that way we create a shaped card base. It's a really easy way to create a shaped card base. Before I attach the two pieces together, I'm using one of the sentiment stamps from the Clear Stamp of the Month, just stamping it into the inside of the card, and I'm just using some Uncharted Mariner Distress ink for that. It makes it a little bit easier, or it's a little bit easier to stamp it at this point than to have everything assembled and then stamp it afterwards. You can see that I had ink on my finger and got an ink smudge at the top of the bottle there, but fortunately that's an area that's going to be glued to the back of the card front, so it's not that big a deal. It's going to be completely covered. Then I can glue the top layer to the bottom layer of my cork piece. I like to use an acrylic block when I'm gluing pieces together. It just holds everything nice and flat, keeps my hands free for gluing other pieces together. And that way too, with using an acrylic block, I can see right through it. So if by chance my pieces shift or move when I place them under the block, I can see that they have done that and I can adjust them right away. So once I have the cork attached to the bottle, my card base is done. I can set that aside to dry and I can start assembling some die cuts. So I have a bunch of die cuts here pre-cut and put in my craft stacks ready to go. For this particular die set, there's a shell with a pearl. For the base of the shell, I have that die cut out of some solid hot foiled prism or solid hot foiled cardstock using the prism foil. Anytime I don't use it in a card, I put it in my specialty card or specialty cardstock drawer. So I have that ready to go. It's a perfect finish for the inside of the shell. The pearl piece is die cut out of pearl finished cardstock from the Antique White Treasured cardstock pack. And I'm going to add some glossy accents once the card's done to give it some glossy dimension to it. For the pieces of my mermaid here, I have the hair and the tail die cut with some 2x2 cardstock, and I have it ink blended with the Fruit Punch color shift pad. It's going to add that little bit of color as well as that little bit of shimmer from the color. My seaweed were die cut out of some waterfall cardstock, and I wanted to give them a little bit of more of a green color, so I used some Summer Sky color shift ink. That has the green color to it, but it has a blue color shift or blue shimmer to it, so when you tilt it in the light, it's got a little bit of a blue tone to it. And then I used a little bit of that vintage photo distress ink on my sandcastle pieces. So with those pieces ink blended, I can start to assemble. And I'm using that same Barely Art glue, and I grabbed my jewel picker for some of these smaller pieces. It just helps to put them in place a little bit better without getting my fingers in the way. Then I can add the top layer to the bottom layer of the sandcastle. These pieces are really, really easy to layer together and to know where everything goes. And I just love the look of this in that bottle. I think it looks absolutely adorable. So I put my main pieces in place just to be able to figure out exactly where I want that seaweed to go. I want that seaweed to go behind that sandcastle. So I'm gluing those in place. And I die cut them twice and ink blended them so I could have like a little bit larger cluster of seaweed. There's also some coral pieces as well as other seaweed pieces in the Die of the Month set. So you could add that to this as well and they would look fantastic together. I always love it when the clubs all work really, really well together, and this month is no exception. You can mix and match a bunch of the different pieces. Like you could even, instead of using the mermaid, use the caboodle die set, use one of those fish in here. I think those would be, or 2 of those fish in here. That would be fantastic. You could also use the deep blue 2, the Die of the Month, and have that whole scene in this bottle as well. So it's a great way to just change up that die set a little bit by having a bit of a different shape to your card base. So after gluing that seaweed down, I added the sandcastle as well as that clamshell and then the mermaid. And I put another one of the wax seal of the month on this particular set. Now, I just glued it in place with the wax seal sticker. What I really wanted to do, I wish I had some jute thread and kind of tied it on there to make it look like a cord around the bottle. I think that would have finished it off really nicely, but I didn't have any. And We're under a heat wave right now, so I didn't want to head out to the store to just get that because it's not next door. So I put all of those together, and I just love the look of that in that bottle. Added a little bit of that glossy accents to the pearl, and then set that aside to dry completely. For the next card, I'm using the deep blue too, and I'm just assembling all of my die cuts ahead of time here. I always do that when I have a bunch of layered die cuts. I find that once the die cut pieces are assembled, it's much easier to move things around and change positions if by chance the look that you're thinking of or the design that you were thinking of may not work for some reason or just doesn't turn out the way that you want. By having those die cuts assembled ahead of time, it just makes moving everything around a little bit easier. For the fish from this die set, I have them all die cut out of black and white cardstock. When I was coming up with the idea for this card, my initial plan was to use those color shift inks to ink blend on these fish to color them. The color shift as well as the interference inks have a property to them that they have one look on white cardstock and a completely different look on black or dark cardstock. So I was going to play around with those properties with these fish and have them nice and shimmery, but nice and colorful as well. However, because my background, as well as the coral, as well as the seaweed, as well as the little scuba divers, because they were so bright and colorful, I ended up not opting to color blend these fish because I just thought the black and white fish would just be a little bit more striking on those colored backgrounds and with all those colored elements to them. But if you wanted your fish to be colored, you could either ink blend them to color them, use the color shifter interference pads, or even use colored cardstock. That would work as well. So for my coral as well as my seaweed here, I'm using the Summer Sky color shift pad for the seaweed. I'm using the Fruit Punch one for the coral. And you can see that I'm not ink blending the entire thing. I want to play with the properties or I want to see the actual color of cardstock that I'm using, but also play with the properties of those color shift pads and have them add some shimmer to some areas and not have shimmer on the regular cardstock. I think it just looks a little bit more visually interesting when you have some regular cardstock as well as the color shift ones and have the contrast between them. There is a lot of pieces for the little scuba divers, even just this scuba mask here. There's 4 different layers to it, but because of all those pieces, it adds so much texture and dimension to these little scuba divers. I absolutely love them. I know that for a lot of people, especially if you're newer to die cutting and newer to layering die cuts, this can be a little bit intimidating, but just take it one piece at a time. So I start off here with doing the scuba mask to do all 4 layers of them, and then I move on to a different area. If you're doing these things, like I said, it can be a little bit intimidating if you're new, but just start with certain areas one piece at a time and it will come together. And like I said, even though it's intimidating having a lot of pieces to it, what that ends up meaning is you end up with a final piece that has a lot of texture and a lot of detail and a lot of dimension to it. And the result has more of a wow factor because of that. So after doing those scuba masks, I took the faces of my little scuba divers, added the hair to them, and then added the masks to them. And then I can add them to their little bodies. Now, the scuba outfits also have, I don't even know what these are called, for like a little harness, I guess, for the tank. So I glue that to the front of them. And again, with these layered die sets, when you die cut the pieces, it leaves an impression. So it shows you exactly where the upper layers to them get placed. So it makes it a little bit easier. And by using that liquid glue, if I don't get perfect placement when I first place that die cut down, I have some wiggle room in order to move everything around. When I'm doing my die cutting, what I will often do is take all of the die cuts that I need, and then I will put them in little piles for the different colors that I want them. I will have my cardstock out, and I will put those dies on the color that I want them die cut. And then as I'm die cutting those pieces, I'll just put them right into my craft stacks that I'm using for that card so that I know that I have all of the die cuts in one area and they're not going to get lost. They're all in the craft stacks and they can't fall out unless I tip it over, which, you know, could happen, but they're nice and secure in one area. So after adding the harnesses, or whatever those front things are called, to the scuba outfits, I added the heads to them. Probably should have waited till a little bit later to add the heads, because I keep moving and moving things around, so the heads don't have enough time to dry, but that's okay. I tend to be a little bit impatient when it comes to assembling things. I just want to see the final look. So there's little mouthpieces. I don't scuba dive, so I don't know the terms for these. So that has 2 layers to it. So I added the top part to the base piece. Then I have the little flippers for their feet, adding those to the bottom of them. And when you die cut these pieces, it die cuts the pieces for both of them together. So I just have them all together, and as I'm figuring out what one piece is for, often I'll be able to, like, there's 4 different hands, but one of them has a different position to it. Sometimes I will use the front of the die packaging to figure out where they intend for that to go. Sometimes I'll put it where it's intended. Sometimes I will completely change it up because I want a little bit of a different look. And that's the nice thing about sets like this with a lot of different options, is you can change things up nice and easily. The liquid glue, I have to say, for pieces like this help immensely, because you can move and shimmy things in place. It does take a few seconds for it to dry, but it starts to grab somewhat quickly. So often while I'm doing these as well, I'll put them under my acrylic blocks to hold them in place. Because this particular one has so many different pieces to it, I didn't want to, or I was constantly working on them, so I didn't really have the chance to do that. Once these pieces are totally done, I can set them aside and start working on the background of this card. So for this one, I'm going to use the 3D embossing folder of the month. I just really like the look of the waves or the water in the background with the fish, and thought that would be a perfect background. I have some white hammer mill cardstock here that I'm using, and I'm just embossing it normal. Sometimes with things like this, I will either ink my embossing folder, or I'll ink blend it and then, or not ink blend it, I'll emboss it and then just run an ink pad over the top just to kind of highlight the embossed background. But for this one, I have that emboss, and I'm going to ink blend the entire background. But I'm not going to highlight those fish at all, but I think it would look fantastic. Because there's so many die cuts to go on top of there, I want that texture in the background, but I don't necessarily want it to compete with the rest of the details of the card. So I'm using the 4 different colors. I'm using the Vintage Photo at the bottom, then I'm using Uncharted Mariner, then the Evergreen Bow and Selvage Patina at the top. Now, I think this would make a great card just on its own, doing this ink blended background, and then say putting like a silver pad and just lightly brushing it to make those fish silver. I think that would look fantastic as well. And it just has so much fun texture to it. Now, the one thing I forgot to mention earlier is the piece of cardstock that I embossed was 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Once it was embossed, but before doing my ink blending, I trimmed it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. The mat for this, the black mat, is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I will use a larger piece of cardstock to emboss and then trim it down afterwards, just in case any of those edges get skewed or the measurements get skewed, and sometimes that will happen when you're embossing cardstock. And by trimming it down afterwards, I can make sure that it is the correct size that I want to go on my card. And then I will do my ink blending. And the main reason I trim it before my ink blending is when you're doing the ink blending, often it'll be a little bit darker around the outside edges to kind of frame it in a little bit. I love the look of that. So I like to trim my pieces before I ink blend my background. If that's not the look that you like, you can keep your cardstock a little bit larger, do your ink blending, and then trim it down. So it just depends on the look that you're going for. So once I have those pieces on my card base, I'm going to start at the bottom, gluing down the coral and the seaweed. And I do go a little bit outside of my ink blended background here. I like the look of it when the die cuts go outside of the frame or whatnot. I think it just looks a little bit more interesting. If you don't like that, you can keep them within the frame, absolutely. But you can see with all of those die cuts, from the scuba divers to the coral to the seaweed, you have so much texture on that embossed background. That's why I didn't find it necessary to highlight the fish in that background, but you certainly could. Last step here is to fill in some of those open areas with those die cut fish. And you can see, because the die cut fish are left black and white, they do really pop on that background. I think if you used colored cardstock or did ink blending on them, I think they'd be a little bit more subtle. So it really, again, depends on the look that you're going for. If you don't want those fish to be quite as prominent on there, use colored cardstock or ink blend them to kind of tie in or blend in with the colors that you're using, and that will work perfect. So here is that finished card there. It has so much texture. I'm not even sure if you can see how much texture it has in real life. The last step here, and I could have done this earlier, but it wasn't until I was done that I thought I should do this, is to add a sentiment to the inside. So I picked one of the sentiments from the clear stamp of the month, put it in my Misty stamping tool, and I just stamped that a couple times with the Uncharted Mariner distress pad. Ties in perfectly with the colors on the front of the card. Really, any of the colors that I used to ink blend the front of the card would work for stamping on the inside. The only one I probably wouldn't use would be the Salvage Patina, only because it's a lighter color, and by using a darker color, it just shows up a little bit better on that white cardstock. My next card, I'm using the stitching die of the month. This creates an adorable origami style boat. The pieces for the stitching are very, very simple shapes. They're just triangle shapes, so the stitching is really, really easy here. I want my boat to stay white, so I'm only using white floss on top of white cardstock. It's just going to add that stitching texture to it, but it's not going to add any color to it. Another thought I think here would be neat would be to use origami paper and then choose a color from whatever print you use for doing your stitching and tie that in. I think that would be absolutely adorable as well. I didn't have any origami paper, otherwise I might have used it. And I also didn't have a printed paper that I thought would work well with the color palette that I was using and look nice on the boat. So I opted to just go with plain white paper, but I really love the final look of it. It's nice and simple. But again, if you wanted the stitching to show up a little bit more, you could use one of the other colors from the color palette that you're using for your cards and do your stitching with that. Whenever I'm doing the stitching, I like to tape my floss in place with that Best Ever craft tape in order to secure it. And then once I'm done, I do that same thing, add another piece of that Best Ever craft tape in order to secure it. I also will almost always die cut another piece for the back and glue those two pieces together. It secures the floss inside between those two pieces, as well as when I go to glue my card together, I'm gluing it with cardstock against cardstock and don't have that stitching in the way. This one piece here that I'm stitching right now is the only piece that I didn't add an extra piece of cardstock on the back. And then when I'm gluing those in place, I like to use some sewing clips, not paper clips, the wooden laundry clothespins would work as well. Just something that hold that in place. You could hold it with your fingers, but then you're sitting there holding something while that glue is drying. And for me, those sewing clips work perfectly. I can put those clips on, set that aside to dry while I'm working on another piece. So all of these pieces, there's a few different sizes, but the stitching is very, very similar. And with Spellbinders stitching dies, there's often a little indent, just like when you do layering dies, there's an indent where the upper layers go. For these ones, there's an indent where the stitching is intended to go. So it, again, is very intuitive. It shows you exactly where they intend to do the stitching. Obviously, you can get creative and change that up a little bit if you want, depending on the stitching die. Some are a little bit easier to change up than others, but it makes it really, really easy. And that stitching on there just adds another level of texture to your cards. So it's just a fun, different way to change it up just a little bit. Another way to change up these stitching die cuts would be to ink blend them lightly before you're doing your stitching. That way you get kind of a little bit of visual dimension to them. And I think it would look great as well with this origami folded boat. I think it would add some nice detail to it as well. So I'm doing several of these on screen. I'm going to do the rest of them off screen because it's really repetitive. Again, the shapes are really easy. They're all triangles. So the stitching is really, really easy for them. So it's really quick to do that. Once I have those pieces done into the side drying, I can add some of the other, or glue together some of the other details. So there's the mask, there's this little flag here. I did the heart. There's a couple options to put on the flag. I chose the heart, and I have that die cut out of Wildberry cardstock for the darker colors and Tutu cardstock for the lighter of the pinks. The sentiment in this set, I die cut out of white cardstock with the letters in it, and then I just die cut a solid piece with that Wildberry. So that Wildberry is going to just peek through just a little bit when I glue that white layer over top of that Wildberry layer. With my stitch pieces all dry, I can start to assemble those. So I add the smaller rectangles first, and then there's that piece that I didn't do that second layer. That's the bottom part of the boat, and then those two those two other larger rectangles that make up the other parts of the bottom of the boat there. So once I have those pieces glued together, I will set those aside with my acrylic block on top of them. Just let that glue completely set, especially because we have the dimension from the stitching as well as that second layer of cardstock. So there's quite a bit of dimension to that piece already. For the background of this card, I have a piece of hammermill cardstock trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to change up the ink blending for this just a little bit. I want it to be lighter behind the boat and darker around the edges of that cardstock. So I did my selvage patina on the inside, the center part. Then I'm doing evergreen bough around that, and then I will do my uncharted mariner around the whole thing just to frame that all in. This way I have like a lighter area. It just kind of highlights where the boat is a little bit. And it also changes up the ink blending a little bit from the way that I've done it for the rest of the cards. I think another option for the background of this, the Stencil of the Month set from June, I think would also be a great addition to some of these pieces. I think they would be a great way to do some of the backgrounds for some of the underwater areas, as well as, you know, the sky wavy parts behind this one. I think it would look fantastic as well. So after doing that ink blended piece, then I add my waves to the bottom. I don't normally do my glue my die cuts to my ink blended background before gluing them to the front of the card, but I did it on this one simply because when you die cut those waves, they're longer than they need to be. I have one die cut out of that waterfall cardstock and one die cut out of oceanside cardstock. I am gluing them to the base of this ink blended piece with my boat in between the two layers. I'm going to let that dry for a few moments, and then I'm going to take my scissors and trim off the excess. I wanted to make sure that my waves were not identical to each other, so I have them offset from each other. And by having those pieces a little bit longer, then I can control exactly how much they're offset, and I can just trim them off when they're completely dry. There's some little strings with flags for this that I have die cut out of tutu and wildberry cardstock as well. So I'm going to glue those on there while waiting for the waves or the bottom part to dry as well. And then I add that sentiment to my background. Since we're waiting for glue to dry, we might as well wait for all of it to dry. So once it's dry, I can use my shears and just trim that excess off. This is something that you could trim off ahead of time if you want, but it's really, really easy to just have that die cut. I think I said earlier that this was cut down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. It's actually cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches because I didn't feel that I needed a mat around this. With that white around the outside from the card, as well as the white accents on the inside, I thought that a mat wasn't necessary here. It would have added an extra step that I didn't feel was needed. To add just a tiny little bit of extra dimension, I'm just using some Stardust stickles on the top of the waves as well as the heart on the flag. Just going to add a little bit of sparkle to it. Just again, a little bit of extra dimension. For my last two cards, I'm going to watercolor the two images from the Clear Stamp of the Month. I have some Distress watercolor cardstock here. I like using it because it's a nice bright white. Often when you use watercolor cardstocks, they're a little bit of a cream or an off-white. And because I have a lot of white in my previous cards, I wanted to keep the background of this nice and bright white. So I choose the two images and then pick out two sentiments that I think go with them. I'm going to heat emboss with clear embossing powder on top of this white cardstock. So it's going to look like it's embossed with white. You could emboss with white embossing powder as well, or choose a different color if you want different outlines to this. I chose the clear only because I used it already in this video for my fish when I was doing the BetterPress, and that way I didn't have another different type of embossing powder in here. But I like, when I'm doing watercoloring, I like to emboss my images simply because it gives that raised ridge around the different areas. For watercolor, it means that I don't have to wait for a certain area to completely dry before watercoloring beside it. So for someone like me that gets a little bit impatient when I'm creating, it means that I can just watercolor whatever area I want. I don't have to wait for anything to dry. That ridge is just going to be a break between the different areas. So because I'm doing clear embossing powder on white, it is a little bit harder to see my embossing, but it's really easy to see in person. You're just heating it until it goes from the matte granular look of the embossing powder and makes it nice and shiny and glossy. For watercoloring my images, I'm going to use some Distress reinkers. These are reinkers for refilling your distress pads. I use them often for watercoloring because I like the translucent part of them, as well as the fact that the colors have a lot of pigment in them. So you can get a really wide variety of shades with the different colors. So I'm starting off with some vintage photo. I'm keeping the colors that I'm using similar to the colors that I've been, or the same as the colors that I've been using to ink blend my backgrounds. I didn't want to introduce new colors to this. So with this vintage photo, I'm going really, really light with my boat. I want to have the white outline for the lines of that boat, but I didn't want it to be white on the inside. Otherwise, you're not going to see those details. So by going in really, really lightly with that vintage photo, you'll see those details, and it'll show up a little bit better off the background as well. For the background or the sky area for my ship in a bottle here, I'm using that evergreen bough. Again, being lighter with it in general, but being darker with it right close to where the water would be. Now, I, in my ink blending, used the evergreen bough as well as the selvage patina. They're very close in tone. So rather than doing any watercoloring with that selvage patina, I just did the evergreen bough and added a little bit of extra water to lighten it so it tied in really well with the rest of the cards. For the Uncharted Mariner, I'm using that for the water. I have a water brush here that has water in the handle. So anytime I need to change between colors, all I have to do is squeeze that handle and I have a nice clean brush ready to work with. I've had this brush for years and use it often. It's a perfect solution to someone like me who tends to be a little bit of a klutz. So if I had a jar of water on my desk, there's a very good chance I would spill it. So by having the water right in the handle of this brush, I know that I don't have a jar of water to spill. Anytime I need to clean my brush out, I just squeeze the handle a little bit. It flushes water right through those bristles, and then I just wipe it on my paper towel that I have to my right, and it just dries that brush off. I can also take excess color off the brush if I find that I have a bit too much color. By tipping or tapping that brush onto the paper towel, it will suck the excess color. So I have pretty good control over how light or how dark my watercolor is. For the flag, I'm going to be using that Fruit Punch Color Shift pad. Now, if you don't have distress-free inkers, but you have some dye-based pads, this is another solution for you. You can just push that pad onto a glass surface or a plastic surface, just something that's non-porous, and use your water brush to pick up that ink in order to color with it. So before I had the reinkers, this is the way I did it. I just put a little bit or smushed a little bit of my pad against a non-porous surface, and it made a perfect color or perfect paint palette. I used a little bit of that Uncharted Mariner against the sentiments just to be able to see them really, really well on top of that watercolor cardstock. I'm going to do some simple ink blending for the background here for the origami boat one. So my ink blending here is very similar to how I've done it for the rest of the cards, doing that selvage patina at the top, the evergreen bough in the center, and then the Uncharted Mariner towards the bottom. So super simple ink blending here. Another option would be to use one of the embossing folders and then add that little bit of texture to that background before doing that ink blending. I chose to keep it fairly simple for this because I wanted the watercolored origami boat to be the star of the show. For this second one here, I'm using the stencil of the month. So I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock that is trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So this stencil of the month, there's little registration marks for a piece of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch cardstock. Because I trimmed my cardstock down ahead of time, it's a little bit smaller, but what I end up doing is matching up the bottom right corner of my stencil, and then once the first layer is done, the next layers are really, really easy to do. If you find it a little bit too difficult, another option is to use a little pieces of painter's tape or best ever craft tape, and I just put a little bit at the top corner, top left corner, and the bottom right corner. That makes it really, really easy to line up those layers as well. For ink blending the different details of this, I'm using some of the Color Shift pads. So here I'm using some of that Fruit Punch pad It's going to add not only that color, but it's also going to add just a tiny little bit of shimmer to it. There are some details on the top of the stencil here that I don't add to some of the layers because it's not the look that I'm going for the particular card that I'm making. This is the background for that ship in a bottle, so I didn't necessarily want the starfish, and I can't remember what the pieces from that first layer were, but I don't mind the bubbles from this one, but I didn't want the starfish kind of floating in the water there. So for that second layer, I used the Summer Sky color shift pad. For this next layer, I'm using both the Coral Waters as well as the Watermelon Spritz. I am going to go in first with that Evergreen Bough and just do the ink blending for those water bubbles. I want them to blend in, or just to kind of be the similar color to the color inked background. Another option here would be to use some, if you wanted to add a bit of extra texture, to use some like Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel would be fantastic as well, but you would need to wait for that to totally dry. For the color shift for this layer, I'm doing the Coral Waters towards the top of the seaweed and then the Watermelon Spritz towards the bottom, so I have a little bit of ink blended color here. I just kind of made the assumption in my brain that these were a little bit more kind of corally, seaweed-ish I didn't want all of my seaweed colors to be exactly the same. I wanted to add some little bit of vibrant color here. For the top part of this stencil, I added a little bit of the Uncharted Mariner for the details for the bubbles, and then the details on the inside pieces of these seaweed or coral pieces. I'm using both the Golden Heather as well as the Lilac Meadow color shift inks. These are both purple, but one is a little bit darker than the other. So I'm kind of color or matching the darker areas from the under layer to the darker areas to the top layer. So there's one layer left here, and it's just a bunch of dots that go in amongst the bubbles in this background. I'm just going to do those with the Summer Sky. I wanted a little bit different color from my background, but I also didn't want them, you know, in your face obvious. So that Summer Sky blends in a little bit, but it shows up a little bit more than just the inks that are on the background. So I did that one nice and quick, and then I'm going to let those inks dry for just a moment or two. There was one part of that stencil that wasn't quite removed, so I just made sure to remove that and get that background there. And you can see it's an absolutely adorable background. This would work really well with the large die of the month as well as the die of the month with those scuba divers. I think it would be a great background with them as well as those die cuts on top of it. There's so many different options and different combinations here. With that background done and set aside to dry, I'm going to do my die cutting of my image pieces from my watercolored pieces as well as the sentiments. Just like at the beginning with the foiled sentiments, I like to tape those in place to make sure they're not going to move on me. These pieces of Best Ever Craft Tape, I use them several times. You can use them like a half a dozen times before the stick doesn't really work too well. So I just keep using them until I find that I don't get enough stick out of them, and then I'll toss them. So they go a long way. So once they are die cut, I have my pieces here ready to go to add to my card fronts. The sentiments for the clear stamp of the month, there's two little banner dies that work perfectly for those sentiments. So this piece here, I went to go put my origami boat on there, and it was just a little bit too plain. So what I ended up doing was cut another piece for my image piece and another piece for a mat, just to kind of create a smaller focal point for that card. But before doing that, I assembled this other card here with a stenciled background. This one is going to have a very simple design to it, so I just am adding that ship in a bottle. And I think I said before that this piece here I had trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. It is actually 4 inches by 5 1/4. I assumed I was putting a mat around there and went by memory, which is really never a good way for my brain to go. For the focal piece for this other card here, I have one piece that is trimmed to 3 inches by 4 1/4 inches, and one piece that is trimmed to 3 1/4 by 4 1/2 inches. So I just chose increments that were even from the original piece or the original card size. I'm going to do my ink blending exactly the same as I've done for the different backgrounds here. So Salvage Patina at the top, Evergreen Bough in the center, and the Uncharted Mariner at the top. It's going to echo the background of the card. It's going to tie in well with that. But because we have a smaller focal point here, it's just going to make that card look a little bit more thought out as well as a little bit more intentional. If I had added other things to this background for the first one, it might have worked with that watercolor piece, but it was just too sparse. And again, it just kind of, it didn't do anything for me. I like it much better with this second frame on it. I think it ties it in and frames it just a little bit better. So with those frames down, I can add the origami boat here. I want that to go towards the bottom, and then my sentiment on the top piece. Now I did the watercoloring on the background of the sentiment with that Uncharted Mariner. You could also have done it with the evergreen bough, and it would have popped enough off of this background, and it would have been dark enough to show off the embossed sentiment, but I actually really like it, the look of it, the way it is with that Uncharted Mariner. For just a touch more texture to my ship in a bottle, I'm just adding some stickles to the water areas, and it's just going to add that little bit of extra sparkle. Most of the time when I do stickles on things, it's Stardust stickle, so it doesn't add any color, it just adds that sparkle. It has a bit of an opalescent iridescent look to it, so it ties in with pretty much any color. There is the final result, and I just love the look of it against that very simple but pretty stenciled background. And then we have our watercolored origami boat. Looks much better with that inner frame to it. It makes it look a little bit more purposeful. And then we have our stitched origami boat. I love it against that background. It's nice, stark, bright white, but that background just frames it perfectly in my opinion. Then we have our little scuba divers. I absolutely love all the texture in this card, and I really don't think it gets shown as much on screen as it does in real life. There's just so many layers and texture to it, thanks to all of those die cuts, and they're just absolutely adorable. Then we have our mermaid in a bottle. I love this little mermaid. I love doing things with mermaids, so I was so excited when that was included in here. And I think those specialty cardstocks are the perfect finish for that clam at the bottom, the clam shell, as well as I love the glossy accents on the pearl. It just makes it, takes it to the next level. Then we have our little goldfish in the bag shaker that has just a little bit of movement to it, but I think it's enough to just make it look a little bit more interesting than a plain card. Then our Emboss Resist BetterPress fish. This has such a fun batik look to it that I think is really interesting and unique. And then our Speckle Prism foiled fish that just really in-your-face speckle. It makes it look like fish scales, and it's perfect for this plate with that ink blended background. And those first 4 cards are really quite simple cards to do, but they just have a lot of impact with that foil. Then we have our bubbles with the opal foil, as well as the bubbles with the prism foil, paired with those caboodle fish friends that have that speckled prism foil die cut for some of the pieces, so they tie in really, really nicely and have just a beautiful sparkle to them. Thank you so much for joining me as I shared the August 2025 clubs for Spellbinders. These ones were so much fun to play with, and I think they will pair with so many other collections that Spellbinders has. I think they'll be used a lot. I can see myself using them a lot. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. Have a fantastic day.